Welcome back, class. We're starting on Unit 6 now, the last unit for this particular course. We'll start off with Chapter 16. Today and this week we'll be looking at Thorndike, Russian objective psychology, revisiting Watson and McDougall and others, Guthrie, Hull, and Skinner. We'll also be talking about Tolman, Behaviorism today, and then we'll lead into our discussions on cognitive psychology. So we start off with Russian objective psychology. Russian objective psychology can be seen to start off with Ivan Sechenov. Sechenov sought to explain all psychic phenomena on the basis of associationism and materialism, the doctrine that nothing exists except matter and its movements and modifications. So the thoughts do not cause behavior. Both internal behavior, mental processes, and external behavior are reflexive in that they are triggered by external stimulation. So the idea here is that all psychic phenomena are based on the associationism and materialism. It all comes from sort of physical or biological entities. So Sechenov proposed the main purpose of the central nervous system was to inhibit reflexive behavior. Human development was the slow establishment of inhibitory control over reflexive behavior. So basically, we have these reflexive behaviors, and the human development was there to establish control over this. He rejected the idea of spontaneous or unelicited behavior. The only valid approach to the study of psychology involved the objective methods of physiology. Then we look at Ivan Pavlov. He won the Nobel Prize in 1904 for his work in physiology. During his work on physiology of the digestive system, Pavlov made an incredible discovery. He discovered the conditioned reflex. He noted that objects or events associated with presentation of food also produce gastric secretions or salivation. He referred to these as conditional because they depended on something else. An early translation of his work mistranslated conditional as conditioned. So, a couple of other tidbits about him. He wanted to be a priest like his father. He worked for Sechenov and changed his mind when he started working for Sechenov. He sold gastric juices of dogs to treat indigestion. He won the Nobel Prize for removing dogs' esophagi, learning how digestion actually works. H.G. Wells wrote about him in one of the New York Times magazine. B.F. Skinner became a fan of Pavlov. He reported to having a really major anger management issue, and he was a critic of communism in the 20s, even after praise from the Russian government. His estates are memorial museums in Russia. So, Ivan Pavlov. So Pavlov was very dedicated to his lab, and he contributed most of his money to support it. The lab made this money by selling gastric juices. People would drink them, apparently. He developed this classical or Pavlovian conditioning. In classical conditioning, an unconditioned response, innate unconditioned reflex, is triggered by an unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus which naturally elicits the unconditioned response out of the organism. For example, food elicits salivation out of an organism. And you may recall that why it is that we salivate. In order for us to taste anything, it must be suspended in a solution of liquid. Therefore, we have developed this idea when food is appeasing to us, we salivate in preparation for being able to taste the food. Alright, so the conditioned reflex or conditioned response is developed by the laws of contiguity and frequency. A biologically neutral stimulus, a stimulus that does not elicit a specific response, is associated through contiguity with an unconditioned stimulus and develops the capacity to elicit some fraction of that unconditioned response. So, for example, the classic example, we have a bell in food, a bell in food, bell in food. The bell was at one point a neutral stimulus. It was neutral when it comes to causing salivation. The food does cause salivation. By pairing together the bell in the food, the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, then we see that it sort of learns or becomes associated with each other, and therefore in the future the bell alone would produce a response in the organism that it previously didn't. It will produce salivation. So at this point, the neutral stimulus has become the conditioned stimulus, and the response to the conditioned stimulus is called the conditioned response. So Pavlov actually used a variety of tools such as a metronome and buzzer and whistle and light in his early experimentations, exploring what would be known as classical or Pavlovian conditioning. So in classical conditioning, the dog salivating to the sight of a person bringing food is an example of classical conditioning, and the salivation is a conditioned response. Through conditioning, the stimuli which control an organism's behavior increase from a few unconditioned stimulus to countless other stimuli which have become associated with unconditioned stimuli through contiguity. All central nervous system activity can be characterized as either excitation or inhibition. The pattern of excitation and inhibition that characterizes the brain at any given moment is what Pavlov called the cortical mosaic. So a couple of other ideas with Ivan Pavlov. We have the notion of extinction and spontaneous recovery. In extinction, if a conditioned stimulus is no longer followed by the unconditioned stimulus, then extinction of the response will occur. So let's say we have bell and food, where the bell became a conditioned stimulus, such that when the bell was rung, the organism would salivate. Let's say now what we're going to do is we're going to try to break that association of the bell to the food, which causes salivation. In order to do that, what we would do is ring the bell. Just keep ringing the bell and do not reintroduce the food. So we leave the unconditioned stimulus out of it. It's not been followed anymore. So the conditioned stimulus is by itself and no unconditioned stimulus follows it. Once that happens, after some time, extinction will occur. That means no longer will that conditioned stimulus bring about a conditioned response. The conditioned stimulus, or the stimulus, would be rung, the bell was rung, but there would be no salivation. After we do extinction and we pause for some time, we can see spontaneous recovery. If a period of time elapses between extinction and the presentation of the conditioned stimulus again, the conditioned response will be observed. This is called spontaneous recovery. It's as if the organism has previously forgotten that that conditioned stimulus had been extinguished. So after some time has elapsed, after the extinction has occurred, they reintroduce the bell and salivation may appear, and that's what we refer to as spontaneous recovery. Then we have the idea of experimental neurosis. It occurs when there's excitatory and inhibitory tendencies are brought into conflict. Just basically think of the idea that you're conditioning some organism and you're conditioning them to two opposed types of things in a way. One that will sort of excite and inhibit, they come into conflict with each other, and that can cause experimental neurosis. So Ivan Pavlov's look at this idea of the signal system. The first signal system, or first signals of reality, the stimuli or the conditioned stimuli that come to single biologically significant events. The second signal system, signals of signals, humans learn to respond to symbols of physical events, use of language and words or symbols returning to events. So, looking at a couple of other ideas, Pavlov did not have a great opinion of psychology, somewhat of a low opinion. He thought the study of consciousness should be studied using scientifically based methods. He believed that by showing the physiological underpinnings of association, he had put associationism on an objective footing, and that speculation about how ideas become associated with each other could finally end. So basically the notion here, he made this area objective. Now we had objective things that we can see, we can quantify, we can count, that were there, and we no longer had to worry about this other stuff that we could not observe objectively. Now, Vladimir Bekharev. Bekharev argued for an objective psychology, which is almost exclusively concentrated on relationships between environmental stimulation and behavior. In later publications, he argued for a discipline of reflexology, by which he meant a strictly objective study of human behavior that seeks to understand the relationships between environmental influences and overt behavior. You should start to see the theme here with these Russian psychologists here. They were all about the objectiveness of psychology. Very much the cornerstone that we will see later when it comes to the movement of behaviorism. Bekharev concentrated on overt behavior of organisms was actually more relevant to U.S. behaviorism than was Pavlov's research on secretions. What Pavlov called conditioned reflex, Bekharev called an association reflex. Bekharev was actually quite critical of Pavlov. Then we have someone that we've heard of before, Vygotsky. Vygotsky was child cognitive developmental area was his key thing. He focused on higher mental processes such as thought in language. And so we see with Vygotsky that there was a sort of a connection between some of the work dealing with the objective psychologist and some of the things that he'd be working on later. Now we see John Watson and behaviorism. So now we're over in the States for the most part. He was influenced by Jacques Liobe. He influenced Watson with his work on tropism. Shows that behavior of simple organisms could be explained as being automatically elicited by stimuli. Very much a behaviorist idea. There are no mental events involved in tropistic behavior. It's all about stimuli in the environment and behavior. No mental aspects going on. So influenced by his early research with rats running in mazes. Early research with the rats running in mazes helped him formulate some of the later ideas regarding a purely objective science of psychology. So early in his career, he publicly announced his behavioristic views. His behavioristic views were severely criticized. He was very much a staunch behaviorist, all about behavior, about the objective nature of psychology. In 1913, he presented his famous lecture, Psychology as a Behaviorist Views It, the Behaviorist Manifesto. Got to be cautious anytime you hear about manifestos. But he presented this Behaviorist Manifesto within which he lays out the basic tenets of behaviorism. And they are: psychology is a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. Introspection forms no essential part of its method. The behaviorist, in his efforts to get a unitary scheme of animal response, recognizes no dividing line between man and brute. So basically, introspection kicked to the curb. Also, they recognize that there is no separation between animals and man in this instance. Therefore, they can do a lot of research with animals. And what they learn from the animals can definitely be applied to man. So, in Watson's objective psychology, the goal was the prediction and control of behavior. He saw four types of behavior: explicit, overt, learned behavior such as talking and writing; implicit, covert, learned behavior, increased heart rate caused by feared stimulus; explicit, unlearned behavior, grasping, blinking, sneezing; and implicit, learned behavior, glandular secretions. All behavior, including thinking, falls into one of these categories. Watson's objective continued: four methods of research: observation, naturalistic or controlled; conditioned reflex method proposed by Pavlov and Bekharev; Testing meant taking samples of behavior and not measurement of capacity or personality. Those things were not relevant from a behaviorist perspective. Verbal reports, which were treated as any type of overt behavior, where it is a behavior. Verbal reports are behavior. Talking is a behavior. Language and thinking were a form of behavior. Speech was simply a form of overt behavior, while thinking was a form of implicit or subvocal speech. There were few simple reflexes, but no complex innate behavior patterns in humans. Our experience is what makes us who we are, a radical environmentalism. Now, of course, you can think these things through. There are going to be some issues with the way he proposed things, but this was him trying to account for all the variety of human behavior, so to speak, or human existence, to try to put it in behaviorist terms, terms that were very much objective. So he proposed that along with a few basic reflexes, humans inherit the emotions of fear, rage, and love. Through learning, emotions come to be elicited by many stimuli, not just the stimuli that naturally elicit them. In addition, all other emotions are derived from these three. So the notion that was going on in his head at this time obviously would give him ideas. And one of the ideas that he had was figuring out how these emotional things could be instilled or conditioned within organisms. Ergo, the research with infants such as little Albert exemplified the conditioning, learning of emotional responses in humans and the counter-conditioning of those emotions. So we see why he wanted to find out if this thing could actually happen, if he could condition an infant, so to speak, to have certain types of emotional responses. So as you have heard already time and time again in various classes, I'm sure, about Little Albert's study, there's a video on your Canvas site that sort of demonstrates some of the live footage that was taken at the time of that particular experiment. Also, you recall too that when Rayner and Watson did the experiment on little Albert, they did not try to extinguish the learned behaviors. Mary Cover Jones continued in this area of research with Peter, who was afraid of rabbits, for example, and this was one of the first examples of behavior therapy, where Mary Cover Jones took it a little bit further to try to decondition or extinguish these learned behaviors. Not necessarily with little Albert. Little Albert was not, quote, fixed in that particular instance, and of course little Albert, there was all sorts of curiosity what happened to him. They did some research a little bit later and found that little Albert, he did survive the experiments, but he did not live much longer after that. He didn't get into adulthood, I understand. But of course the research stated there was no reason to believe that he died early in life because of anything that Watson and Rayner had done to him. And of course, those experiments could not be done today. So he proposed, John Watson had many ideas, as many psychologists and previously philosophers that we talked about previously in this course have many ideas about things that may go beyond psychology, because as you come up with the theories about how you think psychology is, it really says also a lot about how you think humans are and what's the best way to raise humans, the best way to govern humans. So Watson in this instance proposed that children should be raised in an objective manner. And here we go. Little displays of affection. They are to be treated as adults, and Watson also believed that children should receive some sort of sex education. So learning was one of contiguity and frequency. Events are associated in time, which produces conditioning of behavior to occur. He adopted a physical monism position, eventually switched to physical monism position regarding the mind-body problem, rejecting the existence of mental events, consciousness altogether. Remember, going all the way back to our discussions with Rene Descartes and the philosophy of mind, where he came up with this idea of dualism, separating mind and body as two distinctly separate types of things. Here, as we see the start of behaviorism, what he is proposing, John Watson in this case, he is rejecting the existence of mental events altogether. So this monism view is the philosophical view that a variety of existing things can be explained in terms of a single reality or substance. He did not see the need for this notion of consciousness. So behaviorism had two long-lasting effects. Psychology's main goal changed from description and explanation of states of consciousness to the prediction and control of behavior. Overt behavior was the almost exclusive subject matter of psychology. And this was more of a United States or American thing. Over in Europe, they were still doing other things. But over here, overt behavior was the almost exclusive subject matter of psychology at this time. Now, let's introduce William McDougall, another type of behaviorism. He defined psychology as the science of behavior. Okay? He differed from Watson in that he did not disregard mental events as unimportant. Mental events could be studied objectively by observing their influence on behavior. Behavior is goal-directed and stimulated by some instinctual motive. He saw behavior as goal-directed and stimulated by this motive rather than by environmental events. So he thought ignoring the purposeless nature of behavior is missing its most important aspect. Basically the idea, we may behave, but when we behave, we have a purpose for that behavior. And that's the thing that McDougall did not want to miss out on. He saw that as an important aspect of the whole idea of psychology. He believed that all behavior is stimulated by this instinctual energy. All behavior is stimulated by this instinctual energy, and humans are born with a number of instincts that provides motivation to act in certain ways. So again, we're seeing something that we would not necessarily see in the hardcore behaviorist views of Watson here. He's talking about things that propel us, that motivate us in some way. So, a single event or thought tends to elicit several instinctual tendencies. A single environmental event or a single thought tend to elicit these tendencies when two or more of these instincts become associated with a single object or thought. A sentiment is said to exist. Most human social behavior is governed by sentiment. Let's go over that real quickly again. A single environmental event or a single thought tends to elicit several instinctual tendencies. When they become associated, two or more instincts become associated with a single object or thought, a sentiment is said to exist. And most human social behavior is governed by sentiments. So we have a specific event that will elicit these instincts, and when a couple of them become associated with one another, we see a sentiment has occurred. Now let's talk about Guthrie. The law of learning contiguity. Stimuli which accompanies a movement will on its recurrence tend to be followed by that movement. So a stimuli that accompanies a movement will on its reoccurrence tend to be followed by that movement. So the stimuli come back, you will see that same movement. He rejected the law of frequency employed in various forms by most all other learning researchers and postulated that we could have one trial learning. The idea that there could be something significant enough that we learn it once it's done. So the distinction between movement and acts. To explain why practice improves performance, even though one trial learning occurs, Guthrie distinguished between movements and acts. A movement is a specific response to a configuration of stimuli in which an association is learned at full strength after one exposure. An act is made up of movements and a skill is made up of acts. Reinforcement changes the stimulus situation and thus preserves the associations that preceded the reinforcement condition. When reinforcement occurs, the stimulus situation changes and thus the last response made will not be associated with other situations, and when the situation occurs again, the response will occur again. So, configuration of stimuli gets to a specific response, leads to a movement. Several movements together form an act. Several acts represent a skill. We'll stop there for now.